Now, when it comes to Rolex in 2021 and their new releases, I think I speak for most people when I say pretty restrained end results. We saw some variations, some new variations from the Datejust family as well as the Daytona in regards to dials. The Explorer 2 got a slightly modified case, but for the most part, pretty much the same outside of the new calibers inside. But the biggest change this year was the new Explorer, dropping it back down to 36 millimeters, the historical size that is probably most synonymous with the line, also getting a two-tone option. But the standard 124-270 and 36 millimeters is a watch that I think many enthusiasts were really drawn to, and it was a big step from pretty much everything that Rolex was creating at this point was getting larger except this. So what I wanted to do was look at this new variation of the Explorer and compare it to the previous variation of the Explorer, kind of doing a side-by-side comparison. So in terms of what we're gonna look at in this video, a brief history of the Explorer, mostly from a modern context. Don't wanna go through everything, but just giving some background. Also jump into the overview and updates of this new model, talk a little bit more specifically around the new caliber, and then just some closing thoughts at the end on where this one sits, general thoughts on which one to probably go for, and then also discuss how this was a pretty different move considering what was going on with Rolex and many of their other lines. Let's jump into it. All right guys, now before we jump into this video, I do want to mention a cool blog on TeddyBaldassarre.com. I've mentioned this one in the past, but if you've not seen it yet, we made some updates. The best watches under $5,000. We look at several dozen different watches in that list, so check it out. Quick description on it, and should be a good jumping off point if you're looking for, say, your first luxury watch or your next watch in your collection. Check it out down below in the description. Now, I don't want to make this a video on the complete history of the Explorer, but it is important to identify some of the backstory of this piece, especially in recent history. Now, the original Explorer was launched in 1953, a product of know-how gained from Rolex supplying a number of mountaineering expeditions with watches since the 1930s. There is, of course, the lore surrounding Sir Edmund Hillary and his expedition of Everest, which has basically become Rolex's equivalent of Omega's constant reminder of the Speedmaster NASA connection. But it is without question the Explorer set the framework where many sports watches to follow were built, including the mighty Submariner. Now, over the years, the Explorer, like the rest of Rolex's collection, has seen its share of updates, with most collectors of vintage Rolex considering the reference 1016, produced from 1959 to 1989, to be the ultimate expression of the design formula. This reference in many ways set the standard for how the Explorer should look and feel, with classic proportions in a 36mm format. But when 2010 rolled around, Rolex was not even safe from the trend of larger watches and modernized the Explorer with a 39mm case with the reference 214-270, a move that some enthusiasts at the time frankly didn't appreciate. And despite a few updates in 2016 coming with the Mark II, the 214-270 has remained much of the same. And I think now many people have grown fond of the watch, including myself. Things getting larger and more blingy has become part of Rolex in the last 15 years. Look at the new subs, the release of the Sky Dweller, the Yachtmaster 2, and the Explorer 2. All of them either were introduced at a larger case format or got the beefed up treatment. So I think I speak for most people when saying the release of the 124-270 and its return to the original 36mm format was a huge surprise. Starting with the comparison of the dimensions of the two Rolex Explorers, we'll start with the 214-270, this one being known as the Mark II, which is equipped with a contemporary 39mm case diameter, 47mm lug to lug, and 11mm thickness. In many ways, these are more or less the textbook dimensions for a watch of this style, and as a result, this package wears incredibly well on the vast majority of wrists out there, and that even includes myself. However, there is still some presence for a 39mm being mitigated slightly given the dial to bezel ratio that is high in polish and scales with the jump to 39mm. Moving to the new 124-270, we have a 36mm diameter and a drastic drop in the lug to lug being 43.1mm and a surprising jump in the case thickness to 11.5mm, which you can tell, but in no way is this watch thick. Despite the thickness, the 124-270 feels like a proportionally shrunken down version of the 214-270. It has been some time since I've worn an Explorer in this 36mm format, so it took a moment for my eyes to adjust to this drop in size. It is certainly a smaller watch, wearing smaller than a Datejust given the lack of a fluted bezel that just adds some visual dimension through flare. Yet this is undoubtedly a classic. If you're on the smaller end of the wrist size spectrum or at all comfortable with the more mid-century wearing dimensions, this new Explorer will hit the spot. A factor aided by the significant taper of the Oyster bracelet from 19mm at the lugs to 14mm at the clasp, which is itself around 16mm wide. The larger 214-270 also tapers, but from 20mm down to 15mm at that 18mm clasp. So the effect is more dramatic on the smaller new version when paired with the smaller build. Odd number lug width is certainly something to look out for, as the Explorer is known for its versatility with a variety of straps. So I think that is certainly a point that needs to be docked from the newer version, although the Oyster bracelet is the bracelet that I think sets the standard for what a luxury bracelet should be. This Explorer does not feature the glide lock bracelet micro adjustment system, but both the old and new variants do feature short extensions built into their clasps. Other than the sizing, the case architecture and finishing on each of these Explorers is all but identical, with rounded and polished case sides, 90-degree angles at the lugs, the trademark polished step bezel, and fine brushing across the case top, with the Oyster bracelet following the brushed top polished sides formula. And one final point, this might just be my eyes deceiving me, but the new 124-270 also has a bit more of a reflective shine to its bezel, just from my eye, making it feel more showy than normal. It certainly doesn't overstep, but this is something that I noticed when putting these two watches side by side from one another. Maybe it's just in my head, but I couldn't help but notice this. Now, another noticeable change is going to be the dial surface. The older Explorer dial features a matte black dial that contrasts with the polished surrounds on the applied indices and gives the watch just a bit more of a subdued effect. But on the new variant, Rolex opted for a lacquered dial finish that gives a more glossier outcome. Other than the change in finish and the relocation of the Explorer word mark from the 6 o'clock on the 214-270 to just below the words Oyster Perpetual at noon, the dial is classic Explorer with applied Arabic indices at 3, 6, and 9, and rectangular and triangular indices elsewhere as usual. The Mercedes handset remains, though the minute hand on the new 124-270 seems a fraction of a millimeter shorter when compared to the older model, just barely not reaching the base of the minute markings, though legibility is much more of the same and is excellent as an end result. And then really digging into the details, the words Swiss made of the 6 on the new variant separated by a tiny Rolex coronet, which has been a recent practice by Rolex in its new models and featuring this. It's really no surprise that Rolex didn't decide to change too much of this dial. If it's not broke, I don't think you should fix it. And I think when you're dealing with one of the most iconic dials of all time, that's even more the case. Turning both the old and new Explorers over, we have nearly identical sterile casebacks, as is Rolex's custom, but what lies beneath has changed entirely. So the previous Explorer 214-270, since its release way back in 2010, relied on the caliber 3132, a movement released by Rolex in 2008, and based upon the revered 3130, but with a few prominent technological updates, including a blue Paracom hairspring, larger balance wheel, 4 gold microstella regulating screws, and Rolex's Paraflex shock absorbers. Despite the up-tech, the movement specifications and capabilities are straightforward by today's standards, offering really the main point of appeal for Rolex's calibers: reliability and Loctite regulation. In general, the 3132 operates at 28,800 vibrations per hour, 4 Hertz, features hacking and hand winding, and has a power reserve of 48 hours. As the rest of the Rolex collection has been slowly updated to include the new series of 3200 calibers of extended power reserve movements, it only makes sense to see the new Explorer upgraded in this kind with the 3230. The 3230, for clarity, is the no-date version of the 3235 released in 2015 and featured in watches such as the Sea Dweller reference, the 126600, as well as the most modern Rolex Datejust. In terms of the movement up spec, the new 3230 comes with a lot of the aforementioned points from modern tech from the 3132. As ever for Rolex, the caliber is cost certified and regulated even beyond COSC's parameters at -4 to +6, instead being at -2 to +2 seconds a day. And of course, most importantly, this new caliber features the same 28,800 vibration per hour 4 Hz rate, while extending that power reserve to a nice 70 hours, which is the biggest update to this new Explorer apart from the 36mm case size. So in closing, just to kind of discuss what is new. Obviously, 36mm being the biggest change. You have the new movement on the inside with a 70-hour power reserve, and then also the difference in finish. So you have a lacquered dial with a more glossy-like finish opposed to the matte dial on the 214-270. But let's discuss for a moment just this change. Now, as mentioned a little bit earlier, Rolex, as of late, in the last 15 years or so, has really just been having every collection get a bit larger. This is pretty much just taken a hold of the entire industry. But as of late, we've been seeing some changes to that tune. But with Rolex, I was not expecting anything to get smaller, just given what they've been doing as of late. We saw the rise in size to the new Rolex Submariner. So I figured that the Explorer would also kind of follow suit, or at least stay at 39 millimeters. But when I first heard that this was gonna drop at 36 millimeters, this was unexpected, and I think it does go to show that they see something in what this watch represents for their consumer base. Now, Rolex and their consumer base, I think, have a very love-hate type of relationship, which I've been very vocal of on this channel before. But when it comes to this watch, the Explorer, I am a huge fan of the Explorer and what it represents, both the original as well as the Explorer 2. There are two watches, as well as the Milgauss, that haven't really been taken a hold from the sports category the same way in kind of becoming these really hype beast style watches that everybody just wants and also are just gonna try to flip like crazy. They send a different type of message. And I think with the 36 millimeter, for Rolex to even recognize this idea, I think that's partially the reason why this is the case, that this watch is perhaps even more than the Submariner, the most timeless watch that Rolex makes. And in many ways, it was the Explorer that really set the tone for pretty much every other watch that Rolex would make when it comes to a sports category watch. The Explorer is the cornerstone when you think of the world of sports watches from Rolex. And when you get it back to the size that I think most people find synonymous with it, at 36 millimeters, I think this just kind of goes to show where Rolex even thinks of this watch, which sometimes they're never thinking about what are the classic, maybe old school type of collectors thinking about. They're not a brand that thinks about what the collector enthusiast market is, worried about. They are thinking about mass market appeal because that's what they are. They transcend the category of watches. But Rolex also would not make a change like this if it didn't make business sense for them. So if they dropped this down from 39 to 36, chances are they know what's going on. And for a brand that's always looking at this mass appeal, for them to make this change to 36 millimeters, which is very different compared to pretty much everything else that is happening in their catalog, I think speaks a lot to that idea of what the Explorer represents for Rolex, as well as I think for many enthusiasts out there. This is classic, you really can't beat it. Now, in terms of the actual idea of which one to go for, now I have really come to love the 39 millimeter variant of the Explorer, and I almost was finding myself like, I don't really know which one to pick. Now, I noticed with my own eyes that the 36 millimeter, for me, it took some time to readjust. Like, this is a smaller watch. Just considering that it doesn't have that fluted bezel, and I think the fluted bezel just creates a bit more of some just visual dimension that allows it to have a bit more of a showy kind of format, which I think it looks great. I love the Datejust, but this is just a bit more restrained in that regard. And in a lot of ways, although it's not different, of course, it's not really bringing anything new to the table, but you have something that truly is perfect. And I believe the Explorer is a perfect watch. It truly just does everything for the dollar amount. It's so well crafted. It's a beautifully finished piece. It can go with anything. It could be the one and done watch, although the retail elements make it a bit more difficult because, simply put, there's a wait list for this one as well as many other Rolex watches and many people want it. It really is the epitome of a classic Rolex watch, but also doesn't feel as overdone as something like the Submariner, which I can appreciate. So in short, is it an improvement from the 39 millimeter variant? I would say pretty much across the board, outside of the odd number lug width. It's a little bit thicker, but I don't think you're really gonna detect that at all. And the bracelet, of course, is fantastic. Everything else down the board, I think it does the part. The purists are gonna like it. And it's really interesting to tell, and how this might actually, I would say, maybe dictate some other brands out there that might be more inclined to drop down to a smaller case size for some of their watches. If Rolex does something like this, typically other brands tend to follow. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 2 to 3 years. Is this an example where more brands are gonna follow in the future of not being afraid to maybe size something down, or is this just an anomaly because the Explorer is just this watch, this quintessential element of 20th century sports watch design? We will see, time will tell. In addition, big thanks to Bob's Watches for sending us these pieces to shoot and cover in a little bit more detail. Relevant links will be down below if you want to check them out or purchase them. But guys, if you enjoyed this video, you found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that. Also, what other watches would you like to see us cover here in the next couple of months? I've been trying to change up the variety, and I just want to see what you guys would like to see. Sometimes what people say they want versus what they actually view is a very different thing, but love to see those down below. It's really helpful as we kind of just continue to generate ideas. In addition to that, definitely check out teddybaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of all the brands that we carry. Quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, full factory warranty again for all the products that we offer. So if something goes wrong, you're completely covered, and 9 out of every $10 that we generate goes right back into the content. Also, if you want to stay up to date with the content, be sure to follow on Instagram as well and see some cool photos of watches in the process. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.